Welcome to Exploring the Arts. I'm your host, Ed Colley, and today my guest is Alan Bradford. Alan is a lover of comics, as I am, and he spent pretty much a lifetime of collecting all these wonderful comic things we're going to discover today. Before we get into the interview with Alan, I just want to point out that I met Alan 50 years ago, and I haven't seen him since until today. Alan was a student of mine in my very first teaching job. Alan, welcome to Exploring the Arts.
Good to see you, Ed.
Yeah. Now tell me, how did you get interested in this collection of yours?
I started before I could read. My parents would buy me comic books, and of course I'd see them in the newspapers too. Mm-hmm. And I guess I was a typical kid of the 50s. I collected Superman and Batman and all the Disney comics. Those are the three big ones. Mm-hmm. And then I just, like when most people stopped buying comics in junior high or high school, I continued buying them. And I got interested in illustration as well as comics. So some of these books here are not comics exactly; they're illustration related. This is a book of modern fantasy illustrations, ones that have been used as book covers and various other uses in that respect. This particular one has illustrations that have been used in preparation for movies and for books, and there's a section on comic books as well in this particular book. This guy here, Jack Kirby, he's probably one of the most well-known comic artists in the world among comic fans. He created practically all the Marvel heroes except for Spider-Man.
What came first, his work or did Spider-Man come?
He actually started before Spider-Man, but both the guy who created Spider-Man, which was Steve Ditko, mm-hmm. and he both worked for the Marvel Comics Company. And the way things worked in those days was the writer would actually just discuss the stories with the artist. They didn't actually write much down. They'd just maybe a few notes. Then the artist would go home and draw the whole story and bring it back, and the writer would then put in the dialogue. So the so-called artist was actually the writer as well as the artist, because he had the whole job of how to tell the story in pictures, and he would often create things that they hadn't even discussed before.
So a lot of the comic art is a collaborative effort, isn't it?
It all is. Yeah.
When we just see the.
In fact, there's only one exception to that rule. Probably the only one is Charles Schulz. He's the guy who did everything on Peanuts. He wrote it, drew it, and did all the lettering.
Right.
Oh, and this guy too, Bill Watterson, who did
Calvin and
Hobbes.
Right,
he did everything himself too. Mm-hmm. Those are probably the only two in the whole business, though.
You know, having done a comic strip myself, I did one on women, and I knew that I didn't know that much about women to write it from the point of view of a woman. So I had a collaborator with me as well, and she would be the storyteller, and she would write a script, and I saw it as a director of a movie almost.
Right.
Where then I would take and put those words into a movie. I became the director in a way.
You had to figure out what angles the characters would be. And
exactly, and how they looked and how they dressed and so on.
Exactly. Yeah. Yep.
Did these people ever have any real major disputes over their creative project, I wonder?
Funny you should ask.
Well, tell us some.
There's a huge one between Bob Kane, who created, and I use that in quotation marks, Batman. He actually came up with the name, maybe, we're not sure even of that, and he did some of the drawing at first, but then he brought in a guy called Bill Finger, who wrote most of the stories, and after a while Bob Kane didn't even do much of the art at all. He would have a bunch of what he referred to as ghosts who'd do the drawing as well. So
were the ghosts sometimes better draftsmen than the...
All of them were, yeah.
All of them were?
Yes.
Oh, that's interesting.
Jerry Robinson was probably one of the most well-known ones, and another guy by the name of Dick Sprang, and they did the artwork for Batman even as far back as the late 30s, which was when Batman was just starting in the comics. Bob Kane drew the very first Batman story and a few others after that, but that was about it. But he had his name on the strip. It was a contractual thing. He had his name on the strip, and he actually owned Batman for decades, and he was the only one who had his own name on the strip.
Something like that happened with Dick Tracy too, didn't it?
Not aware of that.
I think when the original creator of Dick Tracy died, another artist took over.
Well, that happens a lot, actually.
But they kept the name of the original artist, even though he was deceased.
BC, the same thing. Johnny Hart is no longer with us. But the guys who are doing it now do have their own names on it as well.
They do.
Yes. But usually on comic strips, it's the guy who created it has his name on the masthead, and he would often have people helping him. Even Hal Foster had a few helpers.
He did.
Yeah, but he did most of the work himself.
How would you contrast a book like
Excuse me.
Prince Valiant and a Walt Disney piece? How would you contrast the two? They like two totally different.
Yeah,
elements,
night and day. I mean, it's. Let me show us some Prince Valiant here. A newspaper page would be like yay big in those days, and he would have one entire page in the Sunday comics would be like this. So this is actually smaller than the way it was appeared in the newspapers, and they were telling an adventure story, some humor, but not very much. And in this case, Hal Foster both wrote and drew it, and he did all the coloring as well. But he had assistants.
How did they do the coloring in those days?
Basically, they'd do the drawing in black and white, ink it, so it would be a finished drawing. In fact, I'll show you. These are all shots where this is the way the artwork looks when it's done. He had penciled it, first draw it in pencil, and then ink it in with a brush or a pen. And this is the same strip with the color. But what they would do is he would lay a piece of tracing paper over it, and he would color it in with a magic marker or maybe colored pencils, and he'd make a note on each one as to there's a system called Pantone Matching System, PMS. No laughs there. And each color has its own number, so they'd have numbers for each of the colors, so the printer would know exactly what to use for colors.
Out of your collection here, you have these books here. Is it fair to say, do you have a favorite one?
I have two favorites.
What are they? And tell us why.
Actually, Prince Valiant is my favorite among the adventure strips.
Why is that?
The artwork, not only the artwork, but I like the writing. Prince Valiant is written in such a way that you really get to like the character. He's a very likable character, and not only likable, but he's very smart.
He's also very handsome.
That too, but I don't care about that. He'll come up with a zillion different ways to beat the bad guys, and it doesn't always involve just being better than them with a sword.
You and I shared something earlier that I thought was kind of fun. I was talking to you about when I was a kid, and I always loved comics and comic books, but I always read the pictures first.
Yes, as I said, I was started on comics before I could read, and it did help me to learn to read. When I was in elementary school, they would divide the classes up into top readers and etc. down to the bottom, and all the top readers were friends of mine who were comic book fans.
Okay, so from Prince Valiant, you mentioned you would other.
Oh yeah.
What were they?
This guy here, Carl Barks, who he started out actually working as a Disney story man. He didn't do animation. What he'd do is what they called storyboards. they'd sketch out the story for an animated cartoon on separate strips of separate pieces of paper. And the way they could do it, they'd pin them all to a huge board about the size of this thing in back of us. And they could, if there was one they didn't like, they could just tear it off and replace it. And so he was a story man, as they call it, for Disney. But then he heard that Dell Comic Books were looking for people to do a Donald Duck comic book. In fact, it was one of his friends from Disney that told him about it. And so he and this guy collaborated on the very first Donald Duck comic book in the early 40s. It was called Donald Duck Finds Pirate Gold, and it was it was probably one of the original graphic novels, because it's like 64 pages. But they basically traded off doing artwork. This guy Carl Barks and his friend Jack Hanna was the other guy. When he started doing the Walt Disney's Comics and Stories, which was a 10-page Donald Duck story every month, he started expanding on the Donald Duck character, because in the cartoons, the way he describes him, Donald Duck is just a bomb with a fuse ready to go off. And he wanted to make Donald more of a believable character and a more sympathetic character. He still has his temper, but it's not as bad. And also he introduced other characters that he created himself, including Donald's Uncle Scrooge, which is known as the world's richest duck. He has 3.5 cubic acres of money.
Another fascinating thing about the eclectic stuff that you've brought is, you think of comics as something that children are into, but this is really an adult fantasy, isn't it?
It depends. In the case of Scrooge McDuck and Donald Duck, that he deliberately wrote for children, but he said he never wanted to write down to children. He in fact, the way he put it is, I always wanted to write a story that I wouldn't mind paying 10 cents for. Here's a guy most people probably haven't heard of, but you may have seen some of his art.
I have, yes.
Heinrich Clay. He was sort of a political cartoonist around the early part of the 20th century.
I'm going to open this up and show some of his work.
And gorgeous pen work in Germany. And he had very odd stuff, like animals that would be dancing and stuff.
So the quality of drawing is something I find really fascinating about this. These are as fine a drawings as any fine artist,
absolutely.
Don't you think?
Absolutely, yeah.
It's no minor art by any stretch of the imagination, is it?
No. And unfortunately, Heinrich Clay kind of vanished from sight during World War II. And considering the fact that he did political cartoons that were afflicting the comfortable, shall we say, I'm sure the Nazis didn't like him much.
We were talking earlier, too, about how you put a cartoon piece together and how many different people actually work on the project. I'd like you to explain to us what is something that you did, which was a thing called penciling.
This is done as a cover for a fan magazine, a comic book fan magazine that a friend of mine publishes. And it's a gag about a character called the Shyster, who's he's like the ultimate sleazy lawyer. And the friend of mine who publishes this comic book is a lawyer himself, and he created the character. But I occasionally will do cover drawings for him of his Shyster character.
Is this for the cover design, or is this for? Okay.
Yeah.
So the next thing you do is you go to a thing called an inking, right?
Right.
And this is a piece of
tracing paper that I overlay
like so.
the pencils, and I ink it. And then I take the...
Excuse me, when you're inking this, do you make changes in the inking at all?
You sometimes
make corrections in ink, or
you do I tighten up the drawing. Sometimes there'll be 5 lines on one arm, and I know which line I want to use, so that's the one I ink.
Okay, And
that way I don't have to do any erasing because that's why I do it on the tracing paper rather than inking it on the original.
And this is the final product.
Right. I would scan it in, and in Photoshop, this was done just for black and white because you can only afford to print in black and white.
Yeah.
But I'd add all the shading and the lettering also in Photoshop.
Let me see the next piece.
This was actually originally done as a design for a pewter figurine. I worked for a pewter figurine manufacturing company for 10 years in the 90s. And this was one that never actually got used.
Okay, let me see the next piece.
But here's the
ink.
The inked. And this one I inked with a magic marker.
Not the pen.
I didn't use a brush on this one.
Okay, and this is the finished product.
And this is the finished product, done in color in Photoshop.
Yeah. Wow, what a difference between the inked version and the final version. Amazing. You were also telling me that one of the things you did at one time was you go to these like
the giftware shows.
The giftware shows.
Yes, I was.
Tell us that, and I'd like to get out those things you have to show us.
I will.
Now, what he's done here is a little bit of, I would call it spying a little bit.
Yes, industrial espionage.
Industrial espionage.
When I first started for the company, they wanted to actually use my designs, which was fine with me. I liked doing that. But after working for them for a while, they decided they wanted to play it safe. Mm-hmm. So they would have me do drawings based on competitors' products, and then they'd say, let's do our version of, and they'd hand me either a photo of the product or sometimes the actual product, and that meant let's just change it enough so we don't get sued.
And this is your first sort of pencil sketch.
Right.
And
then I would work with the sculptor who would make it from my design.
And this is the finished product here.
Yeah, that's pewter with little crystals on the wings.
That is so funny. Wow. And what about this character here?
Yep.
There he is, come to life. Wow. But these were your original works. These weren't the stolen, well, let's say, spied on ones.
Right.
We won't use the word stolen.
Borrowed.
Borrowed, right. And this is the last one with the little turtle playing a flute. Oh, those are great. Wonderful. Are you still drawing and creating? You told me you were retired now.
I am retired, but I published my own book. This is kind of an oddball thing.
Explain it. This is quite interesting. Al's Monster Stories.
I've been drawing, as probably you have, ever since you were a kid. Everyone starts out drawing, but most people stop. It's like comic books. Everyone starts out reading comic books, but then they stop. But you and I started out drawing, and then continued drawing.
This on the front page. It says 50 years in the making by Alan Bradford, age 8 and age 58. So the drawings in here are the drawings he did when he was 8 years old.
Yep.
And he's put it into his story. It's a great idea. And if you can get a copy of it, I suggest you do.
It's actually available on Amazon.com.
Is it? Okay. I'll tell you a funny story too. My mother passed away several years ago. And when I was like in elementary school, I did a drawing of a horse and a knight. And it made the newspaper, like kids' drawings do. My mother had cut that piece out of the newspaper and she put it in her wallet. And as a grown man, I didn't know this till later, as a grown man, she would take the wallet out and say, look at my son, Drew. I'm now like 45 years old. She had that thing I did when I was like 8. And when she passed away, it was there in her wallet, that drawing I had done way back, that copy of it. Alan, I just want to thank you so much for taking the time out, coming here and showing us your work. We could talk for hours about your collection. And again, so nice seeing my old student from 50 years ago. Thank you so much.
Glad to do it, Ed.